So maybe it's a symptom of being in the midst of a presidency whose conflicts seem to come from within as much as they come from without. But I think we can all sense that there's an appetite for a look that contrasts with that by peeking inside how the last executive branch operated under President Barack Obama. Outside of words from the president himself, perhaps no peek inside has been as awaited as that from Ben Rhodes, the advisor who, in a New York Times Magazine profile from 2016, was described by his colleagues as having a mind meld with the president. He served as a speechwriter for Obama for the 2008 presidential campaign and came to be the administration's deputy national security advisor for strategic communications, a role that brought him to the forefront of foreign policy debates around the Arab Spring, the resumption of diplomacy with Cuba, and the Iran nuclear deal, and of course the list goes on and on from there. Now out of the White House, earlier this year he co-founded a foreign policy committee called National Security Action, and of course he's written the book beside me, The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House, which has received praise not only from fellow political figures from within the Obama presidency like Jon Favreau and Samantha Power, but also from novelists like Colin McCann, who says Rhodes' writing shakes us out of the ruts of ordinary perception and manages to find hope in the face of most available evidence. Now, joining Rhodes in conversation tonight is another of this country's top foreign policy thinkers, Jeffrey Goldberg. You may know him as editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, as a contributor for countless publications from The Washington Post to The New Yorker to New York Magazine. As the author of 2006's Prisoners, which detailed his experiences working at an Israeli military prison, and specifically his encounter with one prisoner he came to befriend, and perhaps most relevant for tonight's talk, as the conductor of several landmark interviews with Barack Obama that spanned his presidency from beginning to end. So please join me in welcoming both Ben Rhodes and Jeffrey Goldberg to Politics and Prose.
Good evening. Look, people like you, I think.
Some people don't like
Some
me.
people like you. They really like you. Welcome, everyone, to Politics and Prose. Thanks for coming out in such large numbers. We're going to try to cover all of American foreign policy from 1945 to present in the first 5 minutes, and then we'll just see what happens. So I want to, just to make it easy for you, because you don't have any experience with public speaking or the media, I thought I would start with literally the easiest question I could think of, and then move eventually towards Syria. The easiest question is this: what would have been the reaction if Barack Obama had saluted a North Korean general? Just describe it in voluminous detail, what you think the reaction might have been.
So there was one time when we were traveling to Saudi Arabia where he went like this, and that was for years treated as bowing to the Saudis and giving away America's dignity. I think that if he had saluted a North Korean general, he would have been detained upon return to the United States and sent to Guantanamo. I probably would have been killed in a firing squad by the Freedom Caucus. And I do have to say that people ask me what the most dystopian aspect of the Trump administration is, the outright hypocrisy of, I mean, it's almost as if they're trying to find the things that they used to criticize Obama for and embrace Trump for the same things. That seems to happen every day, and that is very much in line with that.
But let me ask you this more serious question. Barack Obama, with you at his side, this is very early, 2007, 2008, there were repeated controversies, and then these controversies carried forward into the first and second terms, repeated controversies where President Obama, and then candidate Obama, said, you know what, it's okay to talk to folks. You know, and remember, Hillary Clinton famously came down on him for being naive, for proposing the idea that you talk to Iran, for instance. So what's wrong with Donald Trump meeting with the leader of North Korea?
I don't think anything's wrong with that, and I prefer diplomacy to the kind of escalation into conflict that we were on. It does matter how you do it, and just to make a few points about that. One, you have to prepare, and I detail in the book that on Cuba, for instance, I met probably 20 times with Alejandro Castro before we put Obama in the room with Raul Castro, his father. And by that point, we had teed up exactly what we wanted to accomplish in that relationship. With Iran, we had probably hundreds of hours of meetings in the Situation Room with Ernie Moniz, a nuclear physicist, a Nobel Prize-winning nuclear physicist, to know exactly what we wanted to get out of the Iran deal. And what I've seen in the North Korea talks is they rushed to get to the spectacle of the head of state summit without knowing exactly what they wanted to accomplish, without setting up an agenda. And my concern is that they gave the North Koreans a lot of things. They conferred upon them international legitimacy that they've never had in the history of their country, just by dint of that meeting in front of those flags, in front of the whole world. They gave them the the military exercises that we engage in with South Korea. For years, we'd heard from the Chinese and the North Koreans that they want us to stop those exercises. Trump announces that he's suspending those. And in return, all we get is a reaffirmation of the same promise to denuclearize that the North Koreans have given us under every administration since Bill Clinton. So it's not that he's engaging in diplomacy, it's that they didn't set it up right, that they gave away too much at the front end. And then lastly, we'd go out of our way to say that we still have differences with Cuba, we still have differences with Iran, we have problems with their human rights record, for instance. The comments he's been making about how Kim Jong-un is beloved by his people, about how he's a strong leader, and today I think he suggested that he wishes that he had a public
people would
snap to attention
when he
like that. It's hard to overstate the extent to which that legitimizes Kim. I mean, one of the things I had to think about in my communications role is how is every word that we say going to be treated in state-run media by other countries? So with Cuba, I knew that anything Barack Obama said, they would pick out the best things. And I can guarantee you that the North Koreans will be running on a loop to their own people, the President of the United States saying Kim Jong-un is respected by his people.
You're describing a tragedy, actually, because the people, the oppressive autocratic regime will use the president's words to actually cement in place the rule of this dictator.
Yeah, endlessly. I mean, they will be playing back the tape of Trump saying those things over and over and over again.
Which brings me to an interesting question. It's a little bit of a meta question in a way. You say that the premature visit or the premature meeting between a U.S. president and a dictator confers legitimacy on the dictator, but can a meeting with President Trump confer legitimacy? And so I'm not asking this in a snarky way. I mean, it's kind of a diminished coin in a kind of way. I mean, so the North Koreans may not benefit as much because the rest of the world looks at this as kind of a little bit of a circus. No.
Well, one, they benefit in the way I was talking about to their own people. Kim has now assumed the stature of both consolidating the nuclear weapons program and getting the meeting with the President of the United States. But also, the Trump administration had been trying to build on sanctions and go around the world and isolate North Korea diplomatically, try to get countries to enforce sanctions more robustly. I think if the rest of the world sees Trump cozying up to Kim like this, that effort will now not move forward. In other words, if you're another country, why would you break diplomatic relations with North Korea when the President of the United States is cozying up to him? If you're China, you're probably thinking, well, I don't really need to enforce the sanctions quite as tightly as I was because now I see that Kim is being embraced by the American president. So I actually think it will have, real world consequences on any ability to apply pressure on North Korea.
So we'll move off this in a second, but one more question on this. It's how do you explain analytically, how do you explain the fact that Republicans, you can name a whole bunch of them, Tom Cotton and so on, who would ride President Obama often, or sometimes at least justifiably, for miscues in diplomacy and so on. How do you explain that they simply don't see or are not willing to see that Donald Trump's behavior is oftentimes a caricature of what they thought Barack Obama's behavior was? Is it just the level of hyper-partisanship means that there's only tribes and no observable truth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, their main criticism of us, as you remember, was he alienates our allies and cozies up to our adversaries. He's too eager to talk to dictators. I mean, we didn't do anything like the last week in that regard. I think you have to just chalk it up to tribalism and the fact that they were, and I walk through this in the book, the sense that anything we did, and it happened while we were in office, by the way, like they would be for something until we did it. So the Republicans in Congress were for intervention in Libya until the moment Barack Obama did it. And they were for intervention in Syria until he went to Congress for authorization. So this was already taking root while we were in office, but I do think it takes an issue, foreign policy, national security, that used to be somewhat distinct from some of the other political issues in our country, and just puts it into a category of tribalism that I think is really destructive, and frankly is probably reorienting the Republican Party's identity on these issues in ways that will be long-lasting.
So there are a couple of ways in which Trump foreign policy, and there is no actual Trump doctrine yet. I mean, we see.
I thought you coined it.
No, I did not. That was not me who coined it. I wrote it down.
Reported it.
I wrote it down. It's a big difference. I'm not going to say it because we're on C-SPAN.
We may have little ears here.
It's a family network. But there are a couple of points in which, and I know that most people from the Obama era disagree with this analysis, that Trump represents a kind of continuum, which is to say the following. Barack Obama was not very happy with NATO allies and their inability or unwillingness to pay their fair share, and he even said to me on a couple of occasions publicly a little bit of dismissal of their willingness to pay up. He did, President Obama, really believe that by talking to your adversaries, you would actually make things better. Do you see any sort of continuum in the way that Donald Trump is approaching the world from what Barack Obama did?
No, I really don't. What I do see, to answer the spirit of your question, there were similar frustrations that they both expressed. That we wanted other countries to bear a greater share of the burden for certain global security challenges, that we had been overextended in the Middle East, in wars in the Middle East. But that diagnosis led to entirely different cures, in the sense that Obama's response to that was to significantly ramp up our diplomatic engagement around the world, to try to enlist allies in new arrangements like the Iran deal or the Paris Climate Accord, to get more stakeholders in the international system. So he basically modeled his foreign policy to broaden the number of countries that were bearing responsibility for issues as diverse as counter-ISIL campaign, Ebola, climate change, nuclear nonproliferation. Trump's reaction to the same diagnosis is, we're going to basically just go it alone, America first. We're going to break with our allies. We're going to basically try to make demands of everybody, treat our allies the same way we treat our adversaries in making those demands. So I think, while they may have expressed similar frustrations that many Americans might have felt about our foreign policy after 9/11 and the Iraq War, the conclusions they drew from those critiques were entirely different.
Right. Let's go all the way back and then move forward up to some of the big controversies of the Obama era. Let's talk about the first time you met Barack Obama. One of the questions I have for you, I've never actually asked you, when you met him and joined with him, did you ever think that he would win?
I did, and my wife is here somewhere, but it was interesting because I describe how I was 29 years old, and one of the things I wanted to do in the book is take advantage of the fact that I was a relatively kind of normal person. I didn't come in with a huge pedigree. I wasn't, an established public figure. I was literally, I described, so nervous the first time I met him, I could barely speak, But I wanted to get onto his campaign because I saw that I thought that he was a different kind of politician. He was willing to challenge certain conventions. He'd been against the Iraq War. And so I was ready to do whatever I could to work my way under his campaign. And I remember I got offered a job on the Obama campaign as a speechwriter and foreign policy aide. And I came home and told my now wife, then girlfriend, and she was a little annoyed that I was moving to Chicago to go into debt to work for this guy. And she was like, but at least you'll be back on February 5th when Hillary clinches a nomination. But I had, what I tried to convey in the book is that there was kind of a magic lightning in the bottle feeling to that '08 campaign where even when we were at our furthest behind, 20 points in the polls in the summer of 2007, like everybody in that room believed that we were going to win. And part of that was, probably youthful idealism. Part of that was actually the ethos of David Plouffe, who made sure that we thought that. And so I had this kind of probably misplaced certainty that this was going to work out.
So go take us forward. How does a person, and I think there are probably a lot of people in this room who would like to know this, we're in Washington, how does a person go from anonymous aide to indispensable, not just speechwriter, not deriding speechwriters too much, to indispensable speechwriter, to indispensable advisor? How does that actually, just carry us through that a little bit?
Well, the key way is that I wasn't trying to do that. Like if I had been trying to have that type of ascent, I don't think it would have happened. I basically did whatever they needed me to do those first couple of years in the campaign and into the White House. So I did speeches, and then I had a certain policy expertise that I was pitching in on, and then I could help with the press, and I was kind of this utility player. And I also, though, and I describe in the book that there was an interesting realization that I had when we came into the White House that because I was a speechwriter, I had to, everybody talks about this kind of mind meld thing, was in the introduction. You're a speechwriter, by definition, that's what you have to try to do. You have to get inside the head of the person you're writing a speech for. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand Barack Obama's worldview, try to understand what he wanted to say, what he wanted to do. And when you come into government, you do realize that there's actually not a lot of people who are trying to do that. Different government agencies have their own institutional biases. Barack Obama didn't have a lot of people around him that he'd known for a long time because he was only in Washington for 4 years before he was president, and 2 of those he was campaigning. So I was someone who was unique in the sense that I understood what his thinking was. He trusted me. I didn't have any bias other than trying to help him say what he wanted to say and then do what he wanted to do. And I also, frankly, didn't have my eye on some job. And in a way that made it easier for me to rise through the ranks because people knew that I wasn't doing something because I was angling for, the deputy something or other.
Take notes, graduate students.
Yeah.
You came into the administration more hawkish than you left, I think. Is that the influence of Barack Obama? Did you change him at all in his worldview?
Well, that's a really good question. It was a convergence of the influence of Barack Obama and the realities that I had to confront in the Middle East, essentially. I mean, I came in and I described being kind of someone who looked up to the kind of liberal humanitarian interventionism view of American foreign policy that had kind of emerged in the 90s and early 2000s. I had to reckon with the fact that in the first several years that we were in office, I saw our military being highly capable of taking out a terrorist network or even an Osama bin Laden deep inside of Pakistan, but being unable to kind of shape events inside of other countries. An obvious example that people point to is Libya, an intervention I supported where obviously after the fall of Gaddafi, things went wrong. But one that gets less attention is Afghanistan. We spent a lot of time designing the surge. It was kind of the high water mark of counterinsurgency theory, which was the belief that we could, with our military, kind of improve the lives of people inside of countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. And you couldn't help but reckon with the fact that for all our military might, we could not kind of put together broken places. And so I had to confront the reality that, these I describe on Syria, which I'm sure we'll get to, sitting there after living the example of Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, I was still arguing for intervention in Syria. And I would say in these meetings, we could blow up the runways where the planes take off, and Obama would look at me and say, well, what happens the next day when they rebuild the runways? I mean, his point being that this was inevitably, if we really wanted to change things, we would be all the way in. And frankly, the track record of our capacity to resolve a civil war was limited. So it was part Barack Obama, part circumstance. Where I then think I did have some, I don't know if I changed Barack Obama, but I think I kind of redirected my idealism. So feeling somewhat frustrated at the intractability of conflicts in the Middle East, it's when I turned to Cuba, to countries like Cuba and Vietnam, and it wasn't that I changed his mind, but I think I said we need to pay attention. We need to find affirmative things to do in the world. That we can't.
Things not in the Middle East, by the way.
Things not in the Middle East. We have so much coming at us every day that we have to carve out time. And you, Barack Obama, need to make Cuba a priority. I know you want to change this policy. I also know it's not going to naturally be on your to-do list. Let me go do this. So I think I hope that. What I was able to do is get him to kind of broaden somewhat the aperture of what he focused on.
You say that he didn't want, and you didn't want to engage in an effort of going to broken places and trying to fix them. That was the George W. Bush experiment, and it didn't work. But undergirding some of the thinking about the Iran deal was this notion that if we just open it up here, that they give us some concessions on nuclear, we'll give them funding and concessions and openness that will change their society for the better, right? I mean, so there's a little bit of a contradiction there, that you don't want to go into certain Middle East countries because they're broken, but Iran, which by our foreign policy definition is broken, certainly in the role that it plays in the world, you could fix. Was there too much idealism underlying the approach to Iran?
Well, first of all, we've had like hundreds of hours of conversations about Iran. I really, can't stress enough that what was beaten into us by Barack Obama was the nuclear deal we're doing to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. We're trying to solve a distinct and discrete problem here. And that's what this is about. This is not about transforming Iran. It's about keeping a bad regime from getting a nuclear weapon. That said, I think we did have a belief that it was more likely that Iran could evolve in a different direction if you had a nuclear deal. But that's like a 10 or 15-year proposition, which we're not going to test now because Trump has scrapped the Iran deal. I really don't think, and I think you can. I wouldn't put words in your mouth, but having covered us at the time, like we did not think that we do an Iran deal and a year or two later suddenly they'd be reorienting the nature of that regime. I do think that we believe that, one, we keep them from getting a nuclear weapon, and two, in this 10 or 15-year period, before some of these sunset provisions that got a lot of attention, it would be more likely that Iran could evolve in a different direction. And look, the supreme leader is going to die. They're going to have changes within their leadership in that time period, and I believe that what Trump did is going to make it more likely that they don't move in a different direction than the Iran deal.
But let's stay on this idealism-realism split because there was a hope not only with Iran, I think, and somehow, and you're correct. Obama was calibrated in the way he talked about the possible outcomes of Iran. He never said publicly, "Oh, this is going to open they're going to change and become Western Democrats," so on. But with Cuba, with Burma, which you are also deeply involved in opening, and Vietnam, these countries have, because of actions taken by your administration, these countries have better relations with the United States than they had previously. But they haven't changed there was a thought on your part, on some other people's part in the administration, that the Cuba opening would lead to some level of liberalization. Yeah. Burma has gone backwards in some ways. Vietnam remains a one-party communist state. So how do you square those openings? In Iran, you were trying to make. You were trying to remove the nuclear threat from the Middle East. What am I missing?
You're right. That with Cuba and Burma and Vietnam is a little different. But Cuba and Burma, I think Cuba has been changing. I think that the difference in Cuba from 2013 to 2017, by Cuban standards, was enormous. By U.S. standards, it wasn't, right? We want there to be...
You get 2 eggs a week.
Well, you get not just that, but like there's internet access, and there's more connectivity to the rest of the... I mean, not uniformly, but there's much more internet access, and there's more connectivity to the rest of the world, and that is bringing, and there's far more self-employed Cubans. I mean, one of the interesting things about our strategy is that a lot of it had to do with the fact that, there was this nascent Cuban private sector, and it went from 10% of Cubans being self-employed to a third of Cubans being self-employed. And that matters. I mean, I remember, I won't use the language fully because of our rule here, but I remember one person explaining to me the difference, which was a Cuban entrepreneur saying to him, I used to work for the state, and so when someone came and knocked on my door and says, you have to be at the Communist Party rally tomorrow, I'd kind of swallow and go to the Communist Party rally. And now I've got my own business, and someone comes and knocks on my door and says, you have to be at the rally tomorrow, and they say, well, blank you, I'm busy, And I think that Cuba, by Cuban standards, there was an opening in terms of people feeling more empowered and connected to the world that is significant. And even in the current context, with Trump kind of rolling things back, I think is still going to lead to more liberalization in Cuba than if we kept this embargo in place. And this is the key point, is that Americans are so impatient. We announced the opening of Cuba on December 17th, 2014. I in my wildest dreams would not have thought Cuba would somehow be, a democracy in any way, shape, or form within 5 years, or maybe even 10. But it would be more open. The lives of the Cuban people would be better. They would have more access to information, and you would begin this evolution inside of Cuba. So part of this is having the patience to stick with the policy. Burma is a much more complicated issue because, on the one hand, you did have a significant transformation in their politics, in that Aung San Suu Kyi and her party were allowed to run for office. There was a democratic election. She won. But it was a partial transition. The military was still in control of the military, and she's prevented from exerting control of the military. The uncomfortable reality of Burma is that more openness, the tragedy that has taken place, particularly last year with the Rohingya, reflects the views of the people of that country, which is a terrible thing to think about. But so the military, I think, chose to demagogue. I mean, I think I see it as part of the kind of trends around the world. The military, being on its back foot politically, says, well, the one thing that we could do as popular is target a Muslim minority ethnic group. And Aung San Suu Kyi can't stop us. And so there, what I would have liked to have seen and hoped that we would have done if we were still in government is apply a lot more pressure on them once they started down that road with the Rohingya. But I do think that in all these cases, if you're promoting democratization, particularly in countries that don't have any tradition of it or any institutions that are ready to transform themselves in a short period of time, you have to be willing to stick with a policy of engagement over time.
Let's talk about Syria for a minute. there's a shorthand that some of us use to describe the foreign policies of the two previous administrations, the George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and it goes like this. It's if the tragedy of the George W. Bush administration was in overreaction to a set of events in the Middle East, the tragedy of the Obama administration could be, it's provisional right now, could be underreaction to a set of events in the Middle East, in particular the cataclysm of Syria. You spent, and your administration spent, the last couple of years of Obama's second term trying not to get on what he called openly the slippery slope. Do you really do believe that American intervention at any level would have made things worse for the Syrian people than they are today?
Well, one of the things I try to lift up in the book is that this question has been so boiled down in Washington to basically this one episode of the Red Line. And what I look back on is, and wrestle with in the book, is that in 2011 and 2012, at the onset of that crisis, before it became a kind of fractious civil war with foreign powers involved and proxies and sectarian dimensions, did we miss a window where some type of more aggressive diplomatic initiative could have forestalled at least some of the human toll that we've seen? So could we have been more aggressively engaged to try to forestall the onset of civil war? One of the things I have to wrestle with, because I was so directly involved in it, is were we, when we called for Assad to go, too optimistic that it was inevitable that he would fall? Look, we all want Assad to go. He is an odious tyrant, and none of us, I think, in this room would believe he should be the leader of Syria. But we might have foreclosed a diplomatic option by calling for him to go at that point. And could we have at least tried to pursue some diplomacy before...
There's a moment, and President Obama said this frequently. He said, it would be foolish or naive to believe that a group of, this is talking about the very early days of the Syrian revolution, that a group of, I think, is it farmers and carpenters and dentists or something like that, would overthrow an Iranian-backed, Russian-backed, autocratic regime. And so the fatalism set in early. I call it fatalism because, of course, no revolution starts with the 82nd Airborne.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, revolutions start small and they grow bigger, especially if they're watered. What explains his pivot away from the Middle East in such a concerted way by that period?
Yeah. Well. First of all, I tried to describe, then this question of do you provide arms, military support to the Syrian opposition, as that option was being developed in 2012, and ultimately he agreed to it in early 2013. The people proposing it were very clear that this was not going to win the purpose of that was not to win the civil war, because everybody knew that Russia and Iran were going to put in much more heavy weapons than we could. It was to get relationships with the opposition, to try to make them more relevant on the battlefield, and that might help in a diplomatic process. There was also an absurdity that I tried to draw out in the book to that time period, because you're in these meetings, and I describe, the deputies committee and principals committee meetings, the policy-making bodies of the U.S. government from different agencies. You go through an agenda.
That used to function.
That used to function, yeah. And, you have multiple issues on the agenda. And I remember there was this issue, in late 12 of providing military support to the Syrian opposition. And there was also an item to designate Al-Nusra as a terrorist organization. And Al-Nusra is an element of the Syrian opposition that is probably the best fighting force in the Syrian opposition. And so it spoke to kind of the schizophrenia of American foreign policy. Well, we want to separate, we want to shine a light on the terrorists there, so we're going to designate them as terrorists. But we don't like Iran and Assad, and so we want to start providing military support to people. But they're the same people, And so the complexity in Syria was constantly there from the very beginning. There wasn't like there wasn't one army to support that was absent of extremists, that could be easily provided with the type of support that would allow them to win. And I think what Obama came to wrestle with is, and I tell an anecdote in the book where I was, when I was still very activist about Syria, I actually had a bunch of journalists in who were foreign correspondents from the Middle East to try to give him a more alarmist view of what was happening in Syria in particular, thinking that if he heard them, that might compel him to act. And because he wanted different voices. And so I said, well, let me bring in some of these people. And one after another, they painted this dire picture of Syria, how complicated it was, how there were many different forces fighting on the ground, how not only were the Iranians and the Russians involved, but the Qataris and the Turks and, Saudis and others. And I thought, well, and everybody thought that the U.S. should be doing more. And I followed him in the Oval Office thinking that, now he's really going to get it. We have to do more. He took exactly the opposite message from that meeting, which is, we can't fix this place, And so he looked at the complexity and thought, if we go to war in Syria, we will be just one more army in this civil war. Unless we're willing to remove Assad ourselves, he will not be removed. If we remove Assad ourselves, it will be the same civil war with us owning it.
Then it's Iraq again.
And look, he may be wrong about that, but that was legitimately his view.
Right. One more question before we go to questions from you all. There's a very, very interesting chapter in your book about race and President Obama. I don't want to highlight it too much. People should read it for themselves. But I'm under the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm under the impression that this is the most frank discussion by an intimate of President Obama, a close aide of President Obama, about how he really felt about his role as the first African-American president. And it's interesting to read, obviously, now in a period of, let's call it, racial reaction. Talk about that a little bit. What you convey in broad strokes is that President Obama was not as unaware of white perceptions of him as he made it out to be publicly. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of describe in the book, and I really didn't mean it to be a pun, but race.
I remember the pun. It's a good pun. It's a good pun. Go.
But basically, the racism was like white noise to us in that it was ever present. It was so omnipresent for all 8 years that it's not like we sat around and talked about it, but that it would come out in these kind of moments where, we'd be prepping him for like an interview or a press conference and say, you may be asked if some of the opposition to you is motivated by race. And he'd be like, yes, of course it is. Next question. And he wasn't going to say that publicly, but it was that.
What would he say when he was asked that publicly?
Well, there are many different factors, and there's in part because and another one just to be more how do we reduce tensions around Black Lives Matter and policing? And he would say, well, I'll say cops should stop shooting unarmed black folks. Next question, And
but why wouldn't he say it?
Well, because
why wouldn't he say it in public? That would be galvanizing, no?
I think it's a couple of things. One, I think he learned early in his presidency that if the Skip Gates thing was much more impactful than people know. So, here he is. He's asked about what do you think about the probably preeminent African American academic in the country being arrested in his house, and he said it was stupid. And the blowback was so insane, and it was like people were so excited to be talking about race on cable television, and it was multiple days of people going back and forth, and Fox going into hysteria. And then we have this absurd beer summit, where Gates has a beer with the guy, and he was trying to fix the economy, and he's like, I can't do this every couple weeks. I can't, I'm trying to get us out of a financial crisis. I'm trying to get us out of some wars. I can't afford this spectacle. And so part of it was, I think, just a belief that, it was difficult for him to engage these issues in a kind of raw way, without it becoming trivialized in kind of the funhouse mirrors of our politics. He was certainly very angry about the birther movement and furious that he had to release his birth certificate. But he wanted to put that behind him. He didn't want to stir the pot. And what he was most angry about, frankly, is that cable television networks gave so much airtime to the birther movement. And I would argue led to the election of Donald Trump, right? And so the point being is, I describe it as he had kind of a Jackie Robinson ethos, which is, I'm the first African American to do this, so I just have to do this job better, twice as good as like a white person would have to, and I have to take all this stuff and just keep my head down. I think late in his presidency, he started to find new ways of talking about this. I think if you look at the speech at Charleston, his visit to a prison, his My Brother's Keeper initiative, his efforts on criminal justice reform, he found a voice to talk about these things the last year or two that was different. And part of that was, I think, experience, and part of it was, we weren't in a financial crisis anymore.
So who was more surprised by Donald Trump's election? Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, or you?
I was most surprised. I won't rank.
They were not surprised.
No, I mean, like I think they were a little surprised. But I think that I try to be candid in the book. It was white people who thought that Barack Obama's election was going to transform race in America, not largely African-American people, certainly not the Obamas. They never believed that because they had the lived experience of being African-American in this country. And so he was far more acutely aware of racism in this country than I was, and far more aware of the forces that might lead to Trumpism. And the fact, I remember, I remember some anecdotes of hearing where I was at kind of events in Washington, kind of casual racism, and that shocked me, but it wouldn't shock him at all, that would happen. So I think what I came to see when I became closer and closer to him is, there's an understanding of the omnipresence of racism in American society that I, as a white person, didn't fully appreciate until I worked for the first African-American president.
Why don't we start taking some questions?
I want to return to Syria on a narrow question that I've often wondered about, and maybe not too important, but late in the Obama years and during the earlier part of Hillary Clinton's campaign, when asked what the differences would be in her approach to Syria compared to the president's, her answer was, well, for example, I would put in a no-fly zone. I would enforce a no-fly zone. And so my question is that just too simplistic? And what was Obama's feeling about that? And does that have any merit whatsoever? Or I don't know how much traction she got on that. It was a small point, but I'd like to know what you think.
Well, the reality is a no-fly zone is one of those options that people were recommending, but our own military was consistently very negative on that, because essentially to actually set up a no-fly zone, you would have to destroy all of Syria's air defenses, including Russian air defenses. You would essentially have to go to war with Assad, and then you'd be flying planes, and they could still be killing people on the ground. It was both a much more complicated thing to do, and it wasn't going to fully stop the killing that you were trying to stop. And so I think, in his mind, first of all, it was never, the military consistently would say this is not a viable option. If we're doing a no-fly zone, we're basically going into an all-out war with Syria, because what we would have to do to set that up and enforce it with confidence would mean bombing Syrian, Russian, and Iranian personnel and hardware on the ground. And then even after we did that, we couldn't guarantee you that they wouldn't just keep killing civilians through other means on the ground. So I think Obama thought it just wasn't a viable military option.
Hey, thanks for coming. You mentioned in the book and the interview that the second term you were kind of looking for affirmative projects to take on. I was just curious if you were in a similar position again, the next Democratic president, say you got a job and you were given free rein, you could pick 2 to 3 affirmative projects, ambitious big idea projects that you could take on. what would those be? And my second quick question is, it says in the book you like Entourage, the TV show. Why?
Wait, that's the most mysterious aspect of Ben Rhodes, by the way.
Well, no, some people thought Obama liking the Macklemore thrift shop song was more mysterious. But to take the second question first, the honest truth actually is that if you're in a job like I had, there is a certain escapism that you're looking for in your entertainment. The more mindless it is, the more it might be what you're looking for at 10:30 on a Wednesday night when you've just spent like 15 hours dealing with the most awful stuff in the world. I was surprised that David Cameron loved Entourage, and that's what I ended up having a conversation with him about. It shows you that the whole pop culture axis has swung in our favor with the British since the Beatles. But that's a great question on your first one. And the reality is, obviously I feel like we'd have to climb pretty significantly out of a hole to begin with. But let me just think about this for 1 second. I mean, I believe that if you take one of the things that was interesting about Paris is it was the first agreement that was that global, that you had, literally 200 countries, the whole world involved in it. And there are other issues that would benefit from that type of global agreement. Some, and just to name a couple, health, dealing with pandemics. I think that there's an architecture that you could try to set up that establish that is truly global, that could save, ultimately, in the long run, millions of lives. If you could replicate the type of global coalition and arrangement and information sharing that we developed in the Paris Agreement related to global health security, that's one that comes to me off the top of my head. I think there's a similar effort that we were trying to get at late in the administration around refugee resettlement. That would be an important project to try to systematize how you deal with refugee crises so that it's not so ad hoc where you have a small number of countries bearing such an enormous amount of the burden. Then I think politically, I still feel like the United States, the region that I was most interested in was ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and I feel like there is a lot of room to try to significantly enhance the integration between the United States and ASEAN countries and the cooperation with the United States and Southeast Asia. So that is a region of the world that I would like us to try to approach, again, with not an individual country eye, but kind of a regional mindset. But the other key thing here is that you have to be opportunistic and look at where might an opportunity emerge. Late in our administration, probably too late to do anything, like Sri Lanka had an interesting election and a democratic transition. And I think if we had more time, we might have tried to really lean into getting more engagement with Sri Lanka. And there are countries like that are both important for our values, but also, China is trying to vacuum up essentially huge parts of the world in their sphere of influence. And so I think you look opportunistically and try to find those places where there's an election that breaks the right way, or there's a movement that is gaining momentum, and on an individual country basis, that's where you try to focus some attention you might not otherwise have out of the White House.
What would you make of the sonic attacks that are happening on diplomats in Cuba and China? And specifically, what do you think the motivations would possibly be of whoever is perpetrating those attacks?
Well, first of all, I think that in Cuba, I just do not see any way that the Cuban government is behind those attacks. They reportedly, and I learned about these months after I left the administration. This started around the transition. The Cubans, as I described in the book, were frenetically trying to do anything they could to preserve their relationship with us at that time. They were signing agreements that had been stalled. They were signing business deals that had been solved. I went down there multiple times. And the notion that at the same time, we made a major agreement on migration with them, the notion that at the same time everything they were doing was to try to preserve our relationship, that they would order some operation that they would know would blow up our
So
relationship.
who's doing it?
I think it's the Russians. I think it's
What about the Canadians?
yeah.
I mean, just a small chance?
Yeah. I mean, I had thought, based on nothing other than my intuition, that the Russians working with some Cubans, right? Because there are people in Cuba who hated the opening with the United States, could be doing that. I described in the book a couple of times that I was trailed by Russian spies when I was negotiating with the Cubans. Very bizarre experience in a Toronto airport hotel, where a couple people kind of walked right up to me, wearing tattoos and weird clothes, and took out an iPhone and just stood about 6 inches from me and took my picture. And like, just to know, the Russians wanted us to know that they were watching, and so whoever's doing it in Cuba wants to break the U.S.-Cuban relationship. And on the list of countries that want to do that, I would put the Russians at the top. That doesn't preclude that some Cubans might be involved. When it happened in China, then that made me think this could also be somebody's surveillance technology just gone terribly wrong. In other words, somebody might have some weird, I don't know if it's sonic or whatever it is, surveillance capability that they're trying to point at our diplomats, and it's causing these health effects because maybe somebody, Russia or China, is doing that in China as well. So it's not out of the realm that nobody's doing this intentionally, that it might be a secondary effect of some surveillance technology.
Yeah. So obviously you're really defined by the Obama's breakthroughs in Cuba and Iran, and I'm a huge supporter of those, and they're historic. But the U.S. has been really at war in the Middle East for most of my adult life, and then that didn't change under Obama. And I'm curious if you see like a tension at all between those two things. And sort of a second point being, what path do you see to constructive U.S. engagement in the region, presumably after Trump is gone? But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I believe that we should have done more to try to bring about some closure to the wars. I mean, to me, we should not be in Afghanistan. Like, I don't know what we're accomplishing in Afghanistan, and I wish that we had ended that war by the end of our administration, because I don't think we're making it better. And every time this argument would come up, and the situation would be, well, if we leave, it will get worse. Well, we're staying, and it's getting worse. And we've been there for 15 years now. And at what point
But if you leave, don't you leave it open for ISIS and Al-Qaeda to come back in and repeat the cycle?
We have the capacity, as I was saying, what our military can do is take out a terrorist safe haven. You don't necessarily need, I think our very presence in Afghanistan has created a completely distorted economy, has clearly not disincentivized people from joining the Taliban, has created some dependency among the Afghan government that is not healthy. I mean, how long is long enough? I mean, is it 20 years? Is it 25 years? I think it's not healthy for a democracy to fight a war for 15 or 20 years, where we're now fighting a war. If I told you in 2002, when we went in Afghanistan, that in 2018 we'd still be fighting a war in Afghanistan, even though Osama bin Laden's dead and Al-Qaeda basically doesn't exist anymore, certainly not in any way, shape, or form related to how they used to, you think that was strange, And so I have to hold myself to the standard that I, put forward, and I actually think we could have done more to disentangle ourselves. I think the main reason why is that, like, people see more risk, candidly, politically, in if you leave, things go wrong, than if you stay and things go wrong. In terms of the next administration, who knows? It's hard to. I don't know what the Middle East is going to look like in 2.5 years. I'm not optimistic that it's going to look any better.
Do you know who the next administration is going to be? Because that would be useful.
Yeah, that would be useful to know too. I do think very quickly, and Jeffrey's heard me say this, like this complete mortgaging of our foreign policy to the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Netanyahu government, I don't think is going to be in our interest. So that makes me pessimistic about things getting better in the next 2.5 years.
So I bear the news that we have time for the next 3 questions, and then we'll have to
Do
call
we
it.
have any women who can ask questions? Is there any? Could you bring? Oh.
And
That's a
mine
magic trick. There you
yeah,
go.
and mine is going to be closer to home. But thank you both for bringing up the subject of race, because it has always been the elephant in the room. And you're absolutely right. We African Americans knew Trump could be elected because we have lived it since the founding of the country. But I wanted to ask you, were you there and did you participate in the speech around the Jeremiah Wright controversy, and also at Mother Emanuel Church in the massacre in Charleston? How much of that was the president himself? And finally, can he run and win in 2020?
No, and trust me, it's very strange to go abroad because people don't understand that. Like in other countries, they're like, isn't Obama going to run in 2020? And I have to explain the Constitution. The honest truth, and this is not, the 3 speeches that Obama really wrote himself in the 10 years I worked for him were the 2 that you cited and the Nobel Peace Prize address.
Well, thank you so much. I hope so.
There were drafts prepared that he then ignored, and all 3 of those drafts he rewrote by hand, and then basically the function of us speechwriters became typing them up. I remember being on the campaign and sitting with Jon Favreau when he got back this voluminous handwritten stuff, and I'm reading this and thinking, I've never read a political speech like this by an American politician, and I had almost chills knowing what was coming. But the reason that we could not have written those for him.
No,
I mean, like the 2 that you cite were just so personal that we could, we put some nice language. I think you can see the Favreau in the race speech because it's about the cable news debates, could go on. But everything else, I mean, that was good stuff. But I mean, the meat of that speech is entirely Barack Obama.
Okay, thank you very much. And he's been here to PNP a few times. And Michelle,
he
too.
supports independent bookstores. Yeah.
So you work for a president who kind of particularly took the moral and the philosophical weights of these massive decisions and tried to work through them. And so that kind of lends itself maybe to a more idealistic or a more value-driven foreign policy as opposed to maybe one that starts with this realist compromise. So when you kind of leave the administration, do you see that as a viable kind of approach to foreign policy, and does that require a unique kind of philosophical leader?
Yeah. Well, what was kind of radical about Obama that I try to convey in here is that he was profoundly idealistic and motivated by a sense of universal human rights in a very different way than American presidents usually are. For him, that manifested itself in everything from, how we treat other countries with a certain kind of respect, how we try to engage other countries in different ways, how we try to speak to publics and not just leaders. It wasn't just the kind of we use these values as the justification for our military interventions or our maybe correct pressure on other countries. It was really taking it as these are universal values that America promotes, not just American values that we try to impose. And so it was a different lens. And so sometimes people felt like he wasn't. I remember I used to talk to some of the people who were about advocates for democracy promotion, and I would say to them, these programs that Obama does to empower and connect young leaders across the world, in Africa and Southeast Asia in particular, are profoundly subversive programs. They're basically creating a civil society in places where there can't be one through the guise of these efforts. And my point is he was promoting those values in kind of non-traditional ways that, I think what made him unique is he was a U.S. president who saw people. He saw individuals in these countries. He saw young people in Laos and in Nigeria and in Ethiopia, and people felt seen by him, and so that to me was I end the book on this hopeful note that what is the impact that he has had on the lives of billions of people around the world? How has he potentially changed their own conception about what they can do to promote change? And hopefully the Obama legacy is something that's not the scorecard that Trump is hacking away at. It's 20, 30, 40 years from now, how has he inspired people in ways that, say John F. Kennedy had inspired people in even his brief time in office. So it was a different way of promoting values. I do think that everybody does it. Authenticity is the most important thing that I believe a political leader can have. And so no one will do it just like Obama. And my hope is that who comes next who actually promotes, universal values and human rights will do it in their own way, informed by their own worldview. And because that's the only way that it's ultimately going to be effective and not kind of ring hollow to people. And frankly, we're going to have a higher bar to clear because America's lost some of the currency that we had as a promoter of human rights under this administration. So the next person who does it is going to have to be really authentic in how they do it, so that it just doesn't, literally bounce off the ears of the people we're trying to reach.
Thank you. So we've heard you talk about this on Pod Save the World, how the Department of State is being decimated, not only from the top up, but from the bottom down. So PMFs are no longer able to rotate through, pathways internships are not being converted, and students like myself are unable to get clearances to participate in summer internships. So what advice do you have for individuals interested in working towards American diplomacy to advance their own professional development while not being disappointed by what this administration is doing to the department?
Yeah, very quickly, one, I think that people should still try to join the Foreign Service because, frankly, if you join now, you will just be kind of beginning to rise through the ranks, hopefully, if there's a new administration. So I think that's still an important option. Number two, I believe that if you're too frustrated and you feel like you can't work for this administration, there's a vast set of opportunities for international NGOs. There are many ways into the world of essentially promoting the values you care about. Again, international NGOs, the UN system, there's a lot of need for good young talent. Three, I would like to see the next administration come in and deeply prioritize this from the beginning. Like maybe grant an amnesty for people who've left to come back in. Spend a lot of money and time on recruitment and trying to rebuild the apparatus of our diplomacy, because the fact of the matter is we've lost like thousands of years of experience and at the same time deprioritized bringing in young people. And I don't think people fully appreciate the profound impact that's going to have on us. This should be like the top priority of the next Secretary of State, or the Secretary of State for the next president, if it doesn't happen now.
So I'm going to go back to the election a little bit. So Timothy Snyder, who wrote Road to Unfreedom, says that Russia basically won a cyber warfare. The Obama administration's reaction during that time was a bit sheepish, like they didn't go full throttle on attacking Russia back. Can you talk a little bit about the deliberation of treating this as a political issue versus a warfare issue, and also what could have been done differently maybe to make Americans more aware of what was going on at the time?
So I think that the mistake actually is that we did treat it as a cyber war when in fact it was an information war, right? And so where I find fault with what we did is that if you even look at the statement from the intelligence community in October before the election, and the focus, it was all on the cyber attacks, the hacking of the DNC, the release of emails, the nexus with WikiLeaks, when that was a fraction of the content that Russia was creating and firing into our politics. We did not do much at all to spotlight the fake news and the information warfare that was being waged by the same capabilities that I saw Russia develop in Ukraine, that they were now applying to the United States. Now, I raised this, and I described raising it with President Obama and him saying, look, the people, number one, I have warned people should have enough information to know that Russia's meddling. But number two, the people consuming stories about Hillary Clinton being on death's door or some made-up story about corruption that were produced by Russians, right? First of all, we couldn't become the editor-in-chief of people's Facebook news feeds. We didn't have a tool to essentially separate out fake news from real news. And secondly, if we started to tell people, well, if you're reading a bunch of these types of stories, they might be Russian fake news. The people consuming that were the people least inclined to listen to Barack Obama, because if you're searching out on your internet feed, if you're the kind of person who's going to get that stuff on your Facebook feed, you probably think Barack Obama is like the Antichrist, right? So that's not to say that was his belief. I think that we, again, could have done more to spotlight the information piece beyond the cyber piece, knowing that we didn't have many tools. We don't have an ability to stop that from happening. We don't have an ability in real time to say what is fake news and what isn't. Going forward, I think that merits a much more aggressive effort to be able to identify what is fake news, to work with technology companies to deal with this in a rational way, and I don't think that's happening.
I understand that when you were younger, you were interested in being a novelist and in creative writing. And I was wondering, after such a long period of time in an office that's such a hotbed of pressure, where you're constantly working under emergency situations, how has your understanding of human beings and human psyches shifted, and how would that interpret or maybe add to any future novels you would write?
It's the best question I think I've ever gotten. Here's how I'd answer that. I'm much more pessimistic. Let's just take the 10-year time frame covering this book. I'm much more pessimistic about systems than I was 10 years ago. Our politics, our government, our media, well, not our government, I don't want to, but basically, I found myself feeling like the systems that I was a part of or that were around me, I wish that they functioned better. And now they seem just outright dystopian. So at the same time, though, I actually, and I'm not just saying this, found myself more optimistic about individual people, that I'd meet. In other words, whether it was in the United States or around the world, I got this opportunity to meet such an amazing diversity of people, including people who had every reason to give up and who were, still, I remember going to Laos and meeting some young people who, literally live in communities covered with American cluster munitions, and they're wanting to come to the United States to meet Americans and wanting to build a relationship with the United States, and grateful that we're providing assistance to clean up these bombs we dropped 40 years, and thinking there's a capacity for kind of forgiveness here that I wish I had more of in my own life. And so in a strange way, the experience of the 10 years left me, again, more interested in individual people and less hopeful or optimistic about the institutions that represent those people. And frankly, if we can narrow the distance between actual people and their representatives in government and the institutions that either govern them or interact with them, I think we'd all be a lot better off. And that to me is the biggest challenge for our politics, is how does politics, and Obama tried to do this, and when he succeeded, it was because he did this, and when he failed, it's because he couldn't. If our politics represented the better aspects of our individuals, we'd be in a much better situation. So if I were ever to write that novel, it would probably be some version of, or nonfiction, how are individuals navigating a world in which they're not well represented by their institutions, and how does that change?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.